Hey everyone, it's David with Streaming Relativity, home of the Astro DNA Observatory. I'm starting the new year with a rig change, which means that the Celestron C8 is on the bench and the AT115 EDT is getting ready to be deployed. So this is a new rig in my collection, and it's a very popular telescope amongst amateur astronomers. And I thought I would start a playlist dedicated to this telescope with videos all about this budget refractor. So if you're interested in this telescope or astronomy or all things astrophotography, go ahead and subscribe, and you'll get notified every time I release a new video. Okay, let's get back to the Astro Tech 115 EDT. Now, this telescope has a reputation that draws what I call the smart money, meaning the inverted price to performance ratio for the scope is considered high by many, which of course is favorable. And when you look at it on paper, I would have to agree. But what about the fit and finish of the scope and the usability of the scope in actual astrophotography sessions? In this video, we'll lay out the specs for the scope alongside a few others, and we'll test that smart money theory. And then we'll get the scope onto one of my benches, and I'll share my first impressions of its fit and finish. We'll wrap up by configuring the scope as part of a rig based on the ASI 2600mm Pro, which is a dedicated astronomy camera. And that's going to put us in a very good position to deploy this baby over, let's say, the next few days to my observatory. And over the next couple months, we'll get some imaging sessions under our belt. Now, to be clear, I own all my equipment, which I pay for with my own money. Anything good or bad that I say is heartfelt, and it's uninfluenced by any third party. So if you want the truth, if you can handle the truth, stick around to the end and enjoy the whole video. Okay, so let's put it all down on paper. And first things first, you got to ask yourself, why are you looking at the AT115 EDT? And the answer really should be that you're looking for a refractor telescope that can be used for astrophotography and something with a focal length in the 600 to 800 millimeter range. And I consider that to be a mid-focal length range, and it's suitable for a wide variety of targets, and includes nebula, galaxy, star clusters, and you can even use it for lunar imaging. And so that's going to narrow down the field to a handful of relatively well-known brand names with models that fit that footprint. So, of course, there's the Orion Eon 115 millimeter ED, the AstroTech AT115 EDT. ASCAR has an offering here, the 120 APO. And then I've included the Explorer Scientific, the ED127 Essentials, even though it's a little bit out of a longer focal length here. I decided to include it to make sure that Explorer Scientific was represented. We could have gone with the 102, which is a shorter focal length at a substantially less price point, but I decided to go with the ED127. Okay, so with that, let's talk about the specs that seem to matter the most, I would say, for a refractor in this category. The first would be the objective design. Every single one of these telescopes employs the same objective lens design, which is an air-spaced triplet. And the triplet design uses 3 lenses to ensure that the different wavelengths of light, the different colors of light, come to focus at roughly the same point. And that's going to minimize what we call color fringing, or it's really going to minimize chromatic aberrations, which includes color fringing and overall image sharpness. And you'll see telescopes with this design often referred to as APO refractors. So that's optical design. Now, the other thing that you have to consider is the glass that's being used in this objective design. And there are many different types of glass that each have their own dispersion characteristics. Most of these scopes don't really publish what specific glass they're using. Rather, they indicate that it's extra low dispersion. And generally speaking, that means it's probably going to be FPL 51 or equivalent. Okay, so the other thing here is that they're all coated. These are coated, meaning that they're anti-reflective coatings on the glass where there's an air-to-glass transition. So essentially, they're all using the same extra low dispersion glass. Aperture. I did point out that Explorer Scientific has a 127 millimeter aperture. Aperture is the size of the diameter of the objective lens system itself, and the larger the aperture, the more light gathering capability that the telescope has. So I'll point out that ASCAR also has a slightly larger aperture at 120 millimeters, and then both Orion and AstroTech share the 115 millimeters. Focal length is determined based on the focal ratio and the aperture of the refractor. So most of these scopes are f7, although the Explorer Scientific has a focal ratio of f7.5. So if we were to take f7 multiplied by the aperture, we would see about 805 millimeters for the Orion and the AstroTech, slightly larger, 840 millimeters for the ASCAR, and then obviously much larger for the Explorer Scientific at 952 millimeters. So the longer the focal length, the smaller the field of view will be, the greater the apparent magnification. So focusers. Interestingly enough, the Orion and AstroTech share a 2.5-inch rack and pinion focuser, whereas the ASCAR has a 3.3-inch rack and pinion focuser, and then the Explorer Scientific, for some reason, is only a 2-inch rack and pinion focuser. General rule of thumb: the larger the focuser, probably the heavier duty it is and the more weight it can support hanging off of it. And then also the larger the focuser, the greater the image circle that the telescope can support. But having said that, I think 2.5-inch focuser should be able to support a full frame sensor without a problem. Okay, so reducers. If you're using these telescopes for imaging, you're going to want a focal reducer / field flattener. You need both capabilities. The focal reducer will speed up the telescope in essence, and then ultimately reduce its effective focal length. And the flattener will ensure that the image sharpness is as high as possible out to the edges of the field of view. So most of these telescopes have a companion 0.8 times reducer, and Orion's is around $250. The AstroTech is around $200. The ASCAR is around $200. The Explorer Scientific has a 0.7x reducer and an adapter that you need to adapt. It's a 3-inch reducer, so it needs to be adapted to the 2-inch focuser that comes natively with this scope, and that combination totals a whopping $569. Okay, so in terms of mounting hardware that comes with these, all of these telescopes come with a narrow dovetail plate, basically a Vixen style. They all have hinged rings, and they have one or more finder scope brackets, Synta-style brackets, but with the ASCAR comes with 2 of the actual brackets attached, whereas the AstroTech and Orion and Explorer Scientific come with 1. Finally, in terms of cases, there's a hard case with the Orion, and AstroTech and ASCAR come with soft case, and apparently the Explorer Scientific Essentials comes with no case. So the only other thing to make note of here is that the ASCAR, all of them have dew shields, retractable, and the ASCAR has an added feature, which is a locking screw for that dew shield, so it doesn't slip. But generally, I find that these dew shields are pretty tight and don't slip on their own. But it is actually a nice feature to have that locking screw. You see it on more premium telescopes. So looking at the price point, clearly the AstroTech is well positioned here. It's this is a sale price of $1,150. I actually paid $1,400 for the AstroTech several months ago. So this is a slightly better deal, or it's about $250 less than what I paid for it. But looking at the price point, I think it's hard to justify Orion. I think they are basically the same telescope with AstroTech coming in at a much better price point. The ASCAR is probably the most interesting competitor here. I might be persuaded to go with an ASCAR over the AstroTech if they were priced similarly. But while the AstroTech is on sale, for sure, the AstroTech AT115 EDT seems to be the smart money on paper. Okay, folks, cool. We've got the AstroTech AT115 EDT, and this is going into my observatory. And I just took out the C8, and we benched her for the winter, and I'm really looking forward to shooting with this refractor. I think refractors are amazing instruments, and it's really hard to beat the view and or the image when you shoot with the refractor. I'll give you the basics on this, and let me just start by why I purchased this. Number one, it has a wonderful reputation with its users, and that means a lot. When you have people who are strong advocates for their equipment, that means a lot to me. And so the other thing is the focal length itself with the 0.8 reducer, which I purchased this with for imaging. It hits a really good spot for me in terms of focal length. 644 millimeters of focal length is really good for the types of images I intend to shoot over the next several months. And the other thing is that I actually think this is a really high quality telescope for the price. And let's face it, this is a very expensive hobby, and it doesn't. Buying really expensive stuff doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to enjoy the hobby more or that you're going to produce images that are that much better. Maybe, but I get a lot out of making my dollar work for me. And so based on everything I've read and the loyalty that exists for this brand and for this telescope, I decided to give it a shot. So the technicals, real straightforward. This is basically a 4.5-inch aperture refractor, meaning the objective lens system is about 4.5 inches, 115 millimeters. It's a triplet design, and they're using extra low dispersion glass. What that is exactly, we could probably research and find out, but it's quality glass, and it's a triplet system and there's coatings for any of the air to glass transitions. The glass involved with those transitions is coated. It's anti-reflective coating. So we know we have a good objective system up front. And let me just talk briefly about the OTA. The OTA itself, solid. I mean, this is a high quality. This feels really good. This is powder coated white. Obviously impeccable. But I like the feel of it. It's not like slippery. It's just enough texture to it so that you can actually keep a grip on it, but certainly not coarse in any way. I measured from the back of the focuser, meaning to the start of this reducer, to the front of the fully retracted dew shield. It's around 25 inches. And of course, the dew shield will extend probably, let's call it 4 inches, in that neighborhood. I didn't measure that, but it does retract. It does extend. I apologize, and I'm sure it does its job. I'm looking forward to testing that out. Now, beyond the OTA, let's talk a little bit about the focuser. This is a 2.5-inch focuser, and which should be more than enough. Is wide enough, I'm sure, for my camera here, which happens to be the ZWO ASI 2600 monochrome camera. and I'm using a 2-inch filter wheel setup here. So 2.5-inch focuser, which is what this comes with, will provide plenty good of an image circle for the 2-inch setup that I have here in terms of imaging. I obviously have an electronic focus wheel on it right now. I'm sorry, electronic autofocus on it, and so I can't demonstrate the fine or even the coarse action on this focuser for you at the moment. But I did test it out, and it was actually quite nice. It was butterly smooth. I'm sure there's always a little bit of backlash in play, but it did not feel obvious or seem obvious. And quite frankly, you can adjust that out very easily if there were. But I didn't detect anything significant. And actually, it's a quality rack and pinion focuser. Okay, so it comes with these hinged rings that get mounted to a dovetail plate here. The only thing I would have really liked to see with a scope at this focal length, I would have liked the option of a Losmandy plate as opposed to this dovetail plate, but that's all right. Astronomics sells a relatively inexpensive solution for this. It was about $39, and I was able to buy a Losmandy plate, which I will be moving this on to. Probably want to get some risers for this. So risers would be obviously between the plate and the rings themselves to bring this a little bit further up and away from the mount deck plate. But I would say these are very high quality. Again, and even there's a little bit of detail in here. They for the rings themselves on the inside, there's a little bit of almost like a gasket, very, very thin, but to protect the OTA, so you can tighten down without too much concern. Now, I have this set up for imaging. I intend to image with this, and hence the reducer. And this reducer's flattener is a 0.8 reducer, and it's designed for this telescope. And it literally screws into the back of the focuser, and then from there there's just a small spacer, and then I pick up my electronic filter wheel. There's this space. I have to double check, but I think this spacer is about the width of an off-axis guider, and I may ultimately go to that. I'm going to test it with a guide scope first. But I may go off-axis guiding from here on out with most of my setups. But it does ship with an eyepiece accessory holder that normally would screw in to the back of the focuser. And what I'll point out is that the focuser you can rotate the entire assembly, the focuser, the reducer, everything can be rotated as one unit. By loosening the screw and tightening the screw to set it in place. If you are not using the reducer, then there is an additional fine adjustment that you can do for camera angle right after the focuser. So you can think of this as a coarse adjustment for your camera angle, and this can be your fine adjustment for your camera angle. What's the difference? Well, frankly, not having to move the entire assembly perhaps is better to lock this down and to use this. But once you go to imaging, you're going to want a field flattener, and then this becomes irrelevant because this does not work in the back for purposes of calculating the back focus that you need 55 millimeters of back focus. This becomes makes it impossible. So anyway, but if you are using either imaging or viewing without the flattener, you'll have this additional fine angle rotator, but you also have the ability to do, obviously, eyepieces that are either 2 inches, and we can do that by removing this adapter. So you can have 2-inch eyepieces, or it comes also with 1 1/4 inch adapter, which you can tighten out with these 3 screws and hold in place. And the eyepiece itself, obviously, this is a compression ring. So you would put your 1 1/4 eyepieces in, and then compression ring to hold it in place. Okay, so it's a complete kit. It is certainly a quality telescope, and I look forward to setting it up and getting some images in the observatory. I'm going to do a video on how I configure this in Nina, because this is a new setup, and I have an observatory, and so I have to do some dome geometry. And obviously we need to also register our new equipment with Nina. So I'm going to do a video on that next. And with that, Happy New Year. Okay, so setting up Nina for a new rig is actually the easy part of this process, especially if you have an existing rig configured in Nina. All you need to do is go to the options area and select that starting profile and then choose copy. There's a little icon once you select this this profile, and that will create a duplicate of the profile settings and makes it really simple if you just go in and edit the stuff that's changed. And this way you can leave anything that's like a global setting, you can leave it alone. So all I needed to do here was select a new camera. In this case is the ASI 2600mm Pro, and that was automatically detected once I plugged it in via the USB 3 port to my observatory computer. And all I did was test to make sure that the cooler was working and USB hub functionality was working and operational, and all looked good. Next, I connected the electronic filter wheel, and did a little listening as I was playing around after I renamed the filter slots. I'm using a 7-position 2-inch filter here, and just wanted to make sure that the filters wheel was rotating to the proper position as I was selecting these different filters. And but that was relatively straightforward. The next step was to connect the electronic autofocuser and make sure that it was pushing and drawing the focuser tube electronically. I also set the 0 value for the focuser, which is the point at which the reducer, the edge of the reducer draws back and reaches the seam with the optical tube assembly. So I set that to 0 as part of the configuration. And then what I generally like to do is just draw the tube all the way out. In this case, I was able to draw the tube out about 95 millimeters, even though specs say around 75 millimeters would be the draw tube length. I was able to go to 95 millimeters, and then that measured out around 26,500 steps or 27,000 steps in that neighborhood. And so that gave me an idea of what the range, and you can set the maximum step for the focuser in Nina as well. And I tested for backlash and actually found very little to none. So I'm guessing it's around 5 to 10 steps, and I'll have to fine-tune this with my first imaging session. Given that I'm using the same guide scope as I was with the C8, I have no configuration steps there. And the only thing I really needed to do here was set the dome geometry, specifically the GEM axis length, which is the distance from the mount axis, the center of the mount axis, to the center of the scope aperture. And so that required a 40 millimeter adjustment because the AT115 rig is smaller than my C8. But other than that, configuring Nina is actually a breeze. Let's move on and talk about the actual back focus calculations. Okay, in order to image using this rig, we will need to set the proper back focus for the optical train. And in this case, that's dictated by the reducer itself. And the documented back focus value for this reducer is 55 millimeters, which is a standard back focus which goes back to the days of DSLR imaging. So this is the distance from the rear of the assembled reducer to the sensor surface. And that will be the sum of the ASI 2600 sensor offset, the width of the 2-inch electronic filter wheel with the filter consideration, and the M54 to M48 adapter to the filter wheel, the T2 to M48 extension tube, and all of these things are together going to equal to 55 millimeters, and they get attached to the back of the assembled reducer. Okay, so let's make sure the math makes sense. We have a desired back focus of 55 millimeters as stated by the Astro Tech documentation. The ZWO 2600 actually has 17.5 millimeter offset, but if you remove the tilt plate, that takes off 5 millimeters, leaving 12.5 millimeters of offset. The 2-inch electronic focus wheel is 20 millimeters thick. You must take into account the thickness of your filter, which I'm using about 1.5 millimeters. That's what I've generally used successfully. There's an adapter that takes up 2 millimeters that allows you to go from 54 to 48. And this is, of course, we're talking about thread size. And then I needed an extension tube of 19 millimeters, and that is a T2 tube that connects to the back of the reducer and connects to the adapter ring for the filter. That gets us to a total of 55 millimeters, which is the optimal back focus for this rig. Will it work? You never know, but it is a good starting point, and it is where we will begin imaging. Okay, folks, I'm going to call that a wrap for the first video of 2024, and I am looking forward to a year of awesome astronomy, awesome astrophotography, and I am wishing the very same for each and every one of you out there. And I have a ton of content planned, not just on the AT115 EDT. I'll be deploying lots of different equipment to the observatory, and which is not only going to be a lot of fun, but it's going to be probably pretty challenging. And so there's a really good chance that we're going to learn some stuff together. And if you have not already done so, go ahead, subscribe. It doesn't hurt a bit. I promise you, it doesn't hurt a bit. In fact, it's a good thing. It's a good thing because you'll get notifications every time that I put a video out, which seems to be about twice a week, by the way. And with that, I want to thank everyone for 2023. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.